Hi, folks. With Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the supposed soul searching and the examinations that the Democrat Party in the United States is going through to understand why they lost the presidential election, and also how, in their view, they failed to connect with certain societal groups, young white men as an example. But they're looking at other things too. I don't know how serious this is, or whether they're just putting on a bit of a show to pretend that we've listened to the people and we're taking it seriously. I don't think it's genuine, but let's assume for the moment it is. I think the Democrat Party and it's a globalist stooge party is really focused on media control, election rigging, election vote counting rigging, and all that. I think that's really their whole ball game. The idea that they'll compete in the marketplace of political ideas and win the people over, I don't think they couldn't be further from their thinking. They don't believe they need to do that or should have to. And by the way, globalist government is imposed ideological government. It doesn't need the consent of the people. You keep the illusion of democracy, of course, but you just rig the elections and rig the candidates and the whole thing. Trump came from out of left field and took everyone by surprise. They've done everything they can to neutralize Trump, including assassinating him, for goodness sakes. And that's, by the way, how far they'll go without blinking an eyelid. Assassination, vote rigging, rigging court outcomes of court cases. They don't even blink an eye at doing that sort of stuff. So I can't see how they're going to, how can we win over straight white men? We've been calling them Nazis for forever, and you're wondering why they're not voting for you. Anyway, let's go through some of this. Now, there's a political analyst that I know in Australia, and I've had a few conversations with him. He's considered to be something of a heavy hitter in the local scene. I understand he's even done some consulting work for the Democrat Party in the past. So he doesn't particularly impress me as a bright guy, but anyway, he obviously knows the right people, and he seems to score lucrative gigs for reasons that I can't get my head around. Maybe that's because I'm too dumb to understand these things. But anyway, he was going through the election. Now, I see the election was a close run thing. Trump won the popular vote by about 2 million votes, so we're led to believe. I think there's somewhere between 10 to 15 million fake votes in there for Kamala, which just shows still how big the vote rigging machine is in the United States, or certainly was in that election. And if you look at the majorities Trump got in the swing states, which he did quite well in overall, the swing, they weren't huge. So a small number of, like quite a small overall vote majority. And in the Electoral College, Trump did okay, but it was no runaway train victory there. In the House of Representatives in the United States, the Republicans won by a handful of votes, a very narrow margin there. And I think, again, there was some vote rigging. It was taking 2 to 3 weeks to count the votes. Some of these districts that looked very promising for Republicans at the outset and somehow flipped to the Democrats over the course of the following weeks of counting. They're very suspicious, very suspicious. Now in the Senate, the Republicans did okay, but that was the previous electoral cycle for the Senate. When Biden was allegedly elected, there were a couple of, I think, brazenly rigged electoral Senate seats that flipped to the Democrats, that were just all down to vote rigging, would be my assessment. So they corrected this when they couldn't rig the vote to the same extent. Then that corrected in the last cycle. So the reality is that the Republicans, Trump, the Trump landslide, in fact, was a very close run thing. Now, whether or not you put that down to the Democrats just simply couldn't rig enough votes, conjure up enough, scare up enough imaginary votes to win, then there is a very plausible case on that, by the way. I would think, there's probably 10 districts that the Republicans would have won in the House of Representatives that are, I would say, in areas where very questionable vote counting practices. The Senate, maybe one Senate seat that they could, which would have given them 54 or something. And again, Trump winning by only a couple of million votes in the popular vote, which against a candidate like Kamala, if that's not a sign in itself of vote rigging, I don't know what is. And doing okay in the swing states. But nonetheless, however you look at it, it was a close run thing. So in my view, this idea that the Democrats like to project it was a land, how could we have lost so badly? We were crushed. So that's not true. It was a very close run thing. A few 100,000 votes, the other way could have swung it to Kamala. It was that close. So my thought is that it was a close run thing. They just couldn't rig and stack the votes enough. That was the only thing. That separated. If they could have just cheated a little bit more, they would have won. Which is a view they came away from, by the way, in the 2016 election. I think they conjured up 3 to 4 million votes for Hillary, thinking that would be enough to get her over the line, to make absolutely sure. But they just got it in the wrong places. And so, and they've been annoyed and irritated and angry about that ever since. They certainly weren't going to make that mistake with Joe Biden. And I would argue in the 2020 presidential election that they scared up somewhere in the region of 20 million to 22 million votes for Biden, fake votes, completely rigged votes for Biden. And they rigged at least 2, if not 3, Senate districts to make sure they had that majority so that they could install all those activist judges, which are the ones that are opposing Trump today and trying to fuck with his policy platform. Just on the issue, though, of the Democrat machine and so on, the view that the Democrats went into the election with, and this was parroted by this electoral analyst in Australia, was that they were pretty confident that if they could get Trump convicted of something, anything, it didn't matter, spitting on the sidewalk, they didn't care. But if they could do that, then they could hold that out, the convicted felon, the convicted felon, the convicted felon. And that would be enough to stymie Trump's vote count. And they were talking, we can maybe 2 or 3, that convicted felon thing they believed was going to be worth 2 or 3% of the total vote, which they figured, given the cheating they were going to do for Kamala, that probably would be enough to get her over the line. They knew she was a weak, or Biden originally. They knew Biden was a comatose there, and then later Kamala. But they figured that the convicted felon thing would be enough to squeak over the line. Turns out it wasn't, and they're quite bitter about that. The other thing they're angry about is they were limited in the amount of vote rigging they could do. And it wasn't the open slather that was the case in 2020, where they could rig votes left, right, and centre, and have mysterious, ballot drops in the middle of the night, and vote counting without scrutineers, and all that. That open season on rigging and cheating and so on, that wasn't available to them this time around. It was in some places and in some areas, but not to the extent they needed to win it outright. And so the irritation they have is, well, why didn't we do a better job of cheating? We should have installed more activists in the vote counting, and we should have done that. Which is now a lot of some of the machinery that they were using and funding and throwing money at and so on through US aid and through other handouts and giveaways. Some of that machinery is being dismantled now in the Trump. I don't think enough of it has been. I think the Trump team have to go much more aggressively after that infrastructure, that vote cheating infrastructure, which cuts across the media, and also all the billions that are given to green groups for supposedly building green, alternative energy and so on, that's being redirected back through NGOs, which are then using that to do vote cheating and or just simply to have a better funded ground game. Just in the recent federal election in Australia, the Globalist Party had at least 4 times the funding of the non-globalist parties. Their ground game was better. I mean, it was better. I think their ground game was better, but they also had a far more numerous presence on the street. Handing out brochures, how to vote cards, activists coming around door knocking, all this sort of stuff, turning out people to vote, supposedly, saying, well, our candidate, loves the people. We're going to do the right thing. Look how many lesbian painting classes we've installed in a local town. So, that sort of stuff. They were going around very active in that area. Also, the quality of the activists, the volunteers for the non-globalist parties were actual real volunteers. Whereas the volunteers for the other party were paid NGO activists who were far more eager, keen, younger, more enthusiastic, presented a much better image, but they weren't volunteers, just rando volunteers. They were paid up NGO activists. Why hasn't that been exposed? The media hasn't touched it or gone near it, but it's, I think, a hugely important point. And so a lot of the Democrat concern is we didn't, a lot of the Trump people were very, very enthusiastic and keen, and they were genuine activists. Our paid activists weren't really up to scratch. So we need to have a better funding and a bigger ground game next time. So those are the areas they're looking at. They're not looking at winning over people by policies. And by offering solutions and dealing with the cost of living, that couldn't be further from their mind. They're looking at what narrative can we spin, and to what extent can we rig the vote and channel illicit, large scale illicit funds to NGOs that can then run a good ground game for us. That's where their activity's going. So I would say these things that they claim they're doing, we're listening to the people and all that's all bullshit. They're not doing anything of the sort. That's all just window dressing. You're being a taster today, your pushback channel. Thank you for listening.